Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're zooming in on a global icon. But we aren't just going to sit here and talk about record sales, streaming numbers, or massive stadium tours. Instead, we're looking at Neil Young not just as a legendary rock and folk musician, but as a direct product of his place, his early struggles, and his geographic identity. So, let's dive right into this.
Before the fame, there was just a boy. Before the international spotlight, all those Grammy Awards, and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductions, Neil Young was just a young kid growing up in Canada. To really understand his music, we actually have to understand the soil he grew out of. This explainer is going to map out exactly how those incredibly quiet, often isolated beginnings forged one of the most distinct, uncompromising voices in modern music. Here's our roadmap for the explainer today. First, growing up in Canada. Then, the Winnipeg music scene. Heading south to global stardom. Exploring the sound of isolation. And finally, taking a look at his role as a voice for change. Let's hit our first stop.
Section 1. Growing up in Canada in those unstable early years.
So Neil Young was born in Toronto back in 1945, but his early life, it was anything but stable and settled. Following his parents' separation, his dad was a well-known Canadian sports journalist. His childhood was really defined by a profound sense of displacement. He was constantly moving across these various small towns in Ontario, places like Omemee and Pickering. And to compound all that instability, he suffered a severe bout with polio in 1951. It actually left him temporarily paralyzed on his left side and confined to a bed for months. So he's experiencing this quiet, rural Canada while dealing with significant personal hardship, which is incredibly far removed from the explosive rock and roll lifestyle he'd eventually command. This wasn't a life of luxury. It was a life of constant motion and deep introspection.
Because of that constant motion and those long periods of recovery, his environment literally became his constant companion. We're talking lonely highways, endless skies, the quiet rural life. These aren't just background details, they're the core sensory elements of the rural Canadian landscape that completely seeped into his subconscious. Imagine the sheer space, the bitter cold winters, and the absolute quiet of those small Ontario towns in the 1950s. No distractions, just vastness. And as we'll see in a bit, these vast, lonely landscapes and the resilience it took to navigate them would eventually echo deeply in the very structure, pacing, and tone of his music.
Moving on to Section 2, the Winnipeg music scene, and finding a sound. Everything really shifted when his mom moved them to Winnipeg, Manitoba. As a teenager, Young suddenly found himself right in the middle of this vibrant, growing local music scene centered around community clubs. He wasn't just consuming music anymore, he was creating it. He began forming bands, most notably an instrumental rock group called the Squires. This was the laboratory where he first started actively shaping his distinct sound. Winnipeg in the early 1960s was freezing, it was isolated from the major industry hubs, but it was fiercely independent. Playing in local halls, driving through the snow to gigs in nearby towns, Neil was cutting his teeth, learning how to captivate a crowd, and experimenting with that heavy, rhythmic guitar playing that would later become his absolute signature.
And here is what's so fascinating. How profoundly different he sounded right from the start. At a time when typical pop and rock of the era was polished, refined, and highly commercialized with these pristine vocal harmonies, Neil was doing something entirely different. His sound, which was this heavy blend of folk, rock, and country, was intentionally raw. It was unpolished. It was honest. His voice was high, fragile, and piercing. Definitely not your traditional pop vocal. He wasn't trying to sound like the immaculate acts coming out of London or Los Angeles. He was bringing the ruggedness, the cold, and the stark reality of his background straight into his chords.
Which brings us to Section 3, South to Global Stardom, and leaving Canada.
By the mid-1960s, Neil realized that to truly make it, he had to go where the industry actually was. So, he makes this incredibly bold move. He packs his entire life into a 1953 Pontiac hearse, named Mort, by the way, leaves Canada behind, and drives straight down to Los Angeles, California. And in this crazy twist of legendary music fate, he runs into fellow musician Stephen Stills while literally stuck in LA traffic. Together, they formed Buffalo Springfield. This wasn't just a new band. This was the catalyst that launched his massive international career. It was this explosive cultural shift from quiet, snowy Canadian towns directly into the booming, sun-drenched heart of the American music industry, right in the middle of the 1960s counterculture movement.
But, and this is a massive but, the Canadian identity never left him. Despite the sudden fame, despite the change in geography, and that intoxicating California scene, his internal roots remained steadfastly tied to where he came from. He never fully assimilated into that shiny pop star mold. He kept his flannel shirts, his rugged aesthetic, and his deeply introspective songwriting. You can take the boy out of Canada, but you absolutely could not take the Canadian landscape out of the boy.
Let's dive into Section 4, the sound of isolation, and how you can hear Canada in the music.
The isolation, the introspection, the honesty. If you listen closely to Neil Young's music, this is exactly what you hear. It's characterized by minor chords, lingering notes, and a profound amount of space between the music itself. That spatial quality, that's a direct reflection of his early geography. When you hear the lonely wail of his harmonica or the heavy, plodding distortion of his electric guitar, you are literally hearing those lonely highways and endless skies translated directly into an auditory experience.
There's honestly no better example of this than his 1972 masterpiece, the album Harvest. Now, this legendary record became the best-selling album of the year in the United States, yet it sounds entirely anti-commercial. It serves as this prime showcase for his distinct sense of space, distance, and reflection. Featuring acoustic, stripped-back tracks like Heart of Gold and Old Man, the album relies on a vulnerability and a rustic simplicity that just transports the listener completely away from the city. When you listen to Harvest, you aren't just hearing a collection of hit songs, you're feeling the vast, reflective quiet of his upbringing brought to life.
Think about his voice on that album, right? And really throughout his entire career. His vocal delivery is notoriously fragile, often teetering right on the edge of breaking, yet it is incredibly powerful. It feels like it belongs to the land itself. It's this brilliant paradox. Just like the rural Canadian landscape can be harsh, biting, and unforgiving in the dead of winter, yet breathtakingly delicate and beautiful in the spring, so too is the musical identity he crafted. It is totally unpretentious and entirely real.
And that leads us to Section 5, a voice for change and becoming more than just music. As his platform grew over the decades, he evolved into a profound voice on the global stage. He committed deeply to environmental activism, political commentary, and continually speaking truth to power. Whether it was helping to found Farm Aid to support struggling family farmers, writing the protest anthem Ohio in the immediate aftermath of the Kent State shootings, or pioneering alternative fuel vehicles, he continually used his massive reach to become a voice for change. He didn't just sing songs to entertain a crowd. He used his platform to comment actively and relentlessly on the world around him, completely refusing to simply play the hits and stay quiet.
So where does all that unyielding drive actually come from? Well, his roots taught him to stand for what matters. That unapologetic honesty, that stubborn independence, and that raw, unpolished truth we talked about in his early music, it's the exact same ethos he brought to his activism. The resilience he learned during this quiet, unstable Canadian upbringing, surviving illness and carving out an identity in isolated towns, all of that forged an artist who fundamentally refuses to be compromised or silenced by industry pressures.
Which brings us to the core takeaway of our explainer today. Where you come from shapes who you become. Neil Young's story isn't just a biography about achieving massive musical success and selling millions of records. It's a story about deep, enduring identity. He is the ultimate proof of a local, specific identity. A boy from the freezing streets of Winnipeg and the quiet, rural towns of Ontario, manifesting entirely on a global stage without ever losing its fundamental essence. Through every decade and every single genre shift, he never stopped being that kid from Canada. So I want to leave all of you with a question to ponder. Do an artist's roots inevitably shape their sound? And taking that a step further, how have your own roots, your hometown, and your early physical landscapes shaped the trajectory of your own life? It's something to think about. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep exploring the stories behind the culture.